The email sat at the top of my inbox like a coin in a slot machine, flat, impossible, and irresistible. Subject: temporary caretaker needed, Blackwell Estate. The message was short, clinical. Dates: immediate start through January 7. Compensation: $18,500 per month, paid on receipt of completed report. Remote property, no guests, no media. Utilities provided. Must remain on site for duration. My bank app had been more direct. 2 overdue notices, a rent reminder, and a small fluorescent red number that made my stomach go cold. The money in this offer would erase that number and buy me time, which, at 32, I had come to understand as the closest thing to forgiveness. I answered within an hour. The reply came with a PDF contract stamped with Blackwell Holdings letterhead and an address pinned somewhere deep in upstate New York. Quorum, they called it in the paperwork. Directions attached. Route 12 north, left at the unmarked intersection by the old radio tower. Follow the gravel for 12 miles. Gate code to be supplied upon arrival. Contact: William Blackwell, estate custodian. Email and phone included. I told myself all the ways it made sense. The house was modern, apparently insulated against weather and prying eyes. The job required nothing more than maintenance, generator checks, snow clearing, keeping the driveway accessible, and a daily report of any anomalies. No phones, no friends, no questions. That last part read like a filter more than a condition. I liked filters. I took the bus to Albany, then rented a beat-up Subaru because winter drives teach you patience the way hunger teaches humility. The day I left the city, the sky felt like a sheet of paper someone had left in the freezer. The trees stood like dark sutures against it. Snow had come early that year, thin at first, then heavy enough to flatten sound. The world beyond the interstate lost its edges. Farms and hamlets shrank into monochrome smudges. I moved through it like a man in a rented coat, thinking in practical sentences. Check oil, bring extra fuel, tape the generator panel, bring the heavy thermos, leave a note for Beth, tell her I'll call when I can. My phone buzzed twice on the road, 2 messages from my sister, light, casual questions about whether I'd be around for New Year's. I typed an answer and deleted it, then pressed the phone face down on the passenger seat where it could not speak for me. Silence in a place like Quorum felt like a commodity. You hoarded it, or it swallowed you. The gate to Blackwell Estate was exactly where the contract said it would be, an iron arch rusting into decoration, a gravel drive that unfurled over a ridge and down into a valley so steep the house below looked like it had been carved into the land. At the turn, the woods tightened, branches interlocking as though people had closed the curtains. The mailbox held the gate code and a sticky note, "Welcome, caretaker," followed by a clean printed hand.
The house sat beyond a ring of trees, all of them tall and straight and scarred, lines carved deep into the bark, like tally marks. I thought at first they were animal scratches until I walked closer and saw the careful, repeated geometry, concentric spirals, hooked runes, circles broken by straight lines. The whole ring was almost surgical, every mark deliberate. Inside the house, the heat was an embarrassment. It felt wrong to carry the chill of the road into a place that had already solved warmth. It was expensive, I realized. Stone floors, imported wood, a living room arranged to look as if life had just stepped away. There were groceries in the pantry, neatly labeled canisters, and a generator room with schedules taped to its wall. A house sitter on vacation would have been delighted and suspicious by turns. I felt both. The first night I slept in the study, which had a view of the dark wood and a bank of windows that gave nothing away. I set my backpack by the door. I ran the generator through its paces because I am a man of rituals. You perform small, sensible acts to keep chaos at bay. Everything hummed. The old clock on the mantel ticked in a slow, patient rhythm. I ate a jar of peanut butter and drank coffee that tasted like distant city streets. Then, late, I heard it. It was a cry that didn't fit the woods, too layered to be an animal and too human to be anything else. It rose like a held note and broke into shorter, choked sounds. It came from beyond the ring of carved trees, somewhere at the border of property and forest. I dressed, walked to the windows, and waited until whatever had made it fell away into a thinned silence. My hands remembered 1,000 small defenses. Check the locks, keep the chain on the door, keep the radio playing soft classical on the battery pack. I slept with the kitchen light on and the knife in its block feeling heavier than necessary. In the morning, I found an email in my sent folder addressed to William Blackwell. The subject line read, "Arrival confirmed." The body was a single sentence. I am on site. The timestamp was 3:14 a.m. I have no memory of typing it. I went into town.
the kind of town that keeps its history in glass cases and its opinions in the general store. Coram's Main Street had one red light and a general store that smelled of coffee and old paper. Emma Sullivan ran the counter. She had a face that had learned to measure strangers carefully and a voice that didn't waste warmth. She counted the money slowly and told me where to find fuel, how the road forked when snow collapsed the markers, and when I asked casually about a handyman or a local who could help with generators, she looked at me like I'd asked a strange question and said, "You'll be fine. We don't get many visitors up there this time of year." That was the first time someone in Coram told me I already belonged. "You're late," Emma said, and then blinked. "Well, you're not late exactly. People get funny with time."
"You don't look like the new fellow I met last week." "You met someone who's staying at Blackwell?" I asked, for the sake of curiosity. Emma's reply was the kind of soft deflection small towns practice like a hygiene code. "We get caretakers, always have. They all come in around the same week. We keep a spare loaf in case they forget bread. Most leave when the first thaw hits. Some stay. We used to have a man named Robert who'd stop by to check the furnace. Good man." She wrapped my change in paper and slid it across. "If you're in any trouble, you go to the library first. Marjorie likes a good reader." At the library, the scent of dust sat like sediment on every shelf. Marjorie remembered everybody and everything in a way that made her a living archive. She pulled a stack of clippings for me before I'd even finished asking. The headlines ranged from "Caretaker resigns under strange circumstances, 1984, to "Estate manager missing, search called off, 1997. The dates threaded across decades like a stitch. There was a roster, full names and small photographs, of men who had lived at Blackwell Estate for short stretches, each one annotated with the phrase, "Not returned after January 17." In the margin of one brittle clipping, someone had penciled 7-year intervals in neat ticks. The paper thumbnails were the sort of thing you read in a slow, failing voice. Names, ages, short sentences. Found near the outer fence, incoherent. Left property without notice, family reports missing. House found locked, caretakers absent. The town's minutes mentioned a boundary dispute. One town council report from 1951 simply read, "Residents urged to maintain distance from Blackwell property." There were no explanations, only the town's polite unwillingness to elaborate. Marjorie pushed a folder toward me. "People leave things," she said. "If you're going to be up there, you should read the local history. It's better than rumors." I sat at a folding table with a mug that said "World's Best Baker" and read. The deeper I dug, the more the pattern hardened into argument. Every 7 years, around the turn of the calendar, a caretaker at Blackwell would vanish or be replaced. Photos across eras showed men with similar features, similar jawlines, vaguely, unnervingly like one another. One photograph from 1938 showed a man with my face in sepia, standing in front of the same stone facade, cigarette in a gloved hand. I held the photo like a lit cigarette between my fingers and felt a vertigo like cold water shoved down my throat. Back at the house, I began to keep a log in earnest. It felt like an act of sanity, an attempt to anchor myself to discrete facts. I wrote every morning, generator hours, battery readings, fuel consumed, any sounds heard in the night. The entries were practical and boring, which is to say they were the only honest things I had left. Day 3, 7:10 a.m. Generator check OK. Temp -2°C. Tracks in snow by tree line heading west. Large, indeterminate.
No wildlife prints matching claws. No footprints near tracks. Left note for Emma on porch. She was out. No memory of writing emails sent 3:14 a.m. Between the logs, I scrolled through camera footage stored on a small DVR in the living room. The system was simple. One camera on the drive, another sweeping the perimeter through the window. There were hours of static and snow, and then, on the third night, a blur that crawled across the edge of vision in a frame and left behind a smear. The timestamp was missing that night, an empty blank where the time should have been. I took the hard drive and copied everything to a portable disk. Later, when I replayed the footage on my laptop, the smear resolved into a shape that, for a single frame, looked like me walking up the drive with a bag over my shoulder. Only that frame was recorded 2 days before I arrived. The frame was grain and shadow, and the sick scrape of something against wood. I felt the edges of the house pressing inward in a way I'd have laughed at in any other life. I started to notice things, the way a man notices leaky plumbing, the small, persistent betrayals of structure. My watch would show 3 hours missing between entries. I'd find notes in my own hand, in the margins of reports, asking questions I did not remember writing. Once, the radio in the study tuned itself to a static station whose music sounded like slow scraping metal and voices singing underwater. I told myself sleep deprivation, the brand new isolation, seasonal affect, every rational explanation I had filed under possible. Then I found the circle.
The ring of carved trees around the estate had a missing segment on the north side where the land sloped down toward a marsh. Someone had cut away the trees in a perfect arc, and nothing grew in the gap, just a depression where snow never took hold. The carved symbols extended down to that edge and stopped, as if the pattern had nowhere left to go. I walked the inner edge and found small mounds of disturbed earth, freshly turned, as if someone had dug shallow graves and then filled them awkwardly. There were scratch marks on the soil, like someone trying to burrow out, and a set of prints that were not human, elongated, toe-splayed, taloned. They were huge. I took photographs because men like me document things to feel less at the mercy of them. When I went back into Coram to press for more information, the town closed around me. People curtailed their sentences. Robert Thompson, who had once maintained coal furnaces and a jaw that could break ice, watched me like he had been expecting the question all along. "It'll be easier if you read William's note," he said finally, as if I were a stranger with a gust of bad weather wrapped in me. He folded his hands in his lap, fingers curled around a cigarette he did not light. "Who's Blackwell?" I asked. "William. He used to come through here."
"He's more old than the rest of us now," Robert said. "Mostly he keeps to his house. He left something in the safe when he left last time. There's a key." He pinched his lip. "Not sure you want to open it." I did not tell him about the photograph from 1938. I did not tell him about the emails in my sent folder. I did not tell him about the blank hours in my day. The omerta towns develop is not created by malice as much as by ritual. People agree to pretend the barn door is always shut. It's a survival technique, like learning to breathe through your mouth in the cold. The safe was small and built into the wall in the study behind a painting. Its dial was smooth as a thumb. In the false back I found paper, handwritten pages clipped together, the ink faded to the kind of gray older documents wear. On top lay a brass key with a tag, WB, caution. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the first letter. William Blackwell, December 27. If you are reading this, and you are not me, then either my instructions were followed precisely, or they were not followed at all. I am telling you now what I was told, and what I learned the hard way, because I wish someone had left me the kindness of a clear lie. The house sits on an old wound in the land. That is the plain description. It is not sentimental. It is not religious. It is a thing here. We call it the Guardian because we did not invent new errors. We borrowed the local name and wrapped a polite word around it. The object is older than our families. It cannot be entirely killed, but it may be kept by ugly means. Every 7 years it needs to be renewed. The means are mechanical, though the damage is not. The means require 2 parts, a vessel to hold the shape the house has made, and a person to make the exchange. The machine copies you. The machine creates the convincing half. You live in the world because something built of wires and false breath steps out and carries your face. The other part becomes what tends the wound. You will have options, and none of them are clean. Pages later, in a cramped, near illegible scrawl, William explained his own failure. How a man tried to stay and ended up like a thing that could not remember a day. How others had burned machines and broken apart containment rings, only to see the boundaries shift and the thing grow hungrier. He wrote of the ring carved into the trees, the language of lines that formed a math he did not pretend to understand. He wrote of a lab below the house where a duplicate had been kept in chilled air and in a field of hums, where it had learned to be him. I felt my throat tighten. The idea that the house could produce a version of me that would step into town and carry on my life like a well-made suit sat with the same dull, sick fascination as any nightmare. If the notes were to be believed, if William's confession was any kind of manual, then the cycle made inhabitants of despair, not monsters. The house made monsters of necessity. That evening, I tore through the rooms with a frustrated, practical anxiety. I needed something to feel like agency. The hidden basement door was beneath a rug in the rear hallway. It had a latch that resisted like knuckles closing. The ladder down smelt of damp and metal. The stairwell dropped into temperature and a low hum that thrummed in the bones, in the same way a terrified animal's heart might. There were pipes and a clean tile floor, and the kind of fluorescent light that bleached color out of the world and left everything a little more honest. The room was not a storm shelter or a root cellar. It had racks of hardware, rows of small machines with resistors and condensers, and a bank of glass enclosures that looked like medical refrigerators. One of them held a figure swaddled in white. At first I thought it was a mannequin wrapped for storage, broad-chested, hairless, but when the light caught the face, it was like watching a photograph step out of a shadow and speak. The lips were sealed, the skin a waxy pale, and the jawline was my jawline, crooked and softened like a face in ice. A thin tube ran from the figure's neck into a machine that breathed with a mechanical rhythm. I stood there with the key still warm in my hand, and William's letter turned over in my mind like a coin. Machines do not care about compassion. They do not bargain. If the notes were to be trusted, then this thing, this figure, was the second half of the bargain. It waited on humid air and electricity. On the table beside the enclosures, a binder sat open, labeled Operations. There were diagrams and schematics, notes written in careful blue ink. One page showed a ring of trees drawn in plan view, small marks at regular intervals. Another diagram showed two silhouettes, one labeled Original, the other Replica. Between them, arrows. Between them, a box labeled Containment Field. I had read enough to understand an outline. The house copied. The copy stepped out. The original tended the wound. When the hours ran out, the machine would need resetting, where the containment would fray, and that fraying was an invitation. I was breathing fast. The room hummed like an insect trapped in a jar. There were recordings, small thumb drives, and when I played the first, the voice that filled the speakers was not William's, but a thin clinical man explaining protocols. He spoke of arterial samples and synthetic tissue synthesis and the ethical calculations of disposability. He used words like exchange and commissioned replacement, and spoke of the 7-year cycle in tones so detached it was obscene. I shut the recorder off because I could feel the house listening back. I took photographs. I took notes. I felt like I was memorializing something that was not yet dead. I left the door propped by a wrench so light could leak down the stairs, as if I were leaving a trail. I had the key in my pocket, the binder in one arm, and William's letter like a lit match in my head.
The rational part of me cataloged options. Accept, walk away, call Beth and tell her what had happened. Neither of those felt like answers. That night, the cry came louder. It was closer and more patient, like someone testing a lock. I wanted to sleep and did not. I wanted to call someone and could not. I wanted to leave and stayed, because leaving felt like stepping into a world that would not accept the price I'd been given. I made a final log entry for the day and wrote a sentence I had not planned. Day 6, 11:23 p.m. The hum fluctuates tonight. In the basement, the replica breathes. In my head, William's words are a list of things I will not be able to undo. If there is anyone out there reading this who still believes in tidy endings, do not. There is no tidy, only churn and choices. In the small hours I climbed the back stair alone and found the backyard ring lit by a thin sliver of moon. The carved marks on the trees were sharper at night, shadows brimming between the lines. The missing segment looked like a mouth. I stood with my breath clouding and felt my hands hum with adrenaline. For a moment I imagined myself walking to that gap and stepping out onto the slope, letting the world swallow me like a mistake, and that thought was not repelling as much as it should have been. I woke with soil under my fingernails and a cut on my palm and the bitter taste of metal in my mouth. The clock flicked 2 a.m. I had no memory of how I'd gotten there. There was a smear of mud on the back of my jacket. On the table beside where I had been sleeping, a notebook lay open to a page I did not remember writing. "We are overseers," it said in my handwriting, which made my stomach drop out. "We watch and we record. We make choices and leave the world in a state we pretend not to own." The days began to compress. The house's rhythms dominated me. The generator's cycle, the furnace's complaining draw, the way the light slipped through the windows at the same minute each morning. Sometimes my hand would write things I did not intend. Sometimes my phone would buzz with messages that had been sent by me in hours I could not account for. Once, when I checked the camera at dawn, a figure walked up my driveway and paused as if to study the view. It wore my face. I am pragmatic enough to tell the difference between guilt and necessity. The machine in the basement had made something that could be me. William had written about the option people sometimes chose. Acceptance. Let the machine do its work. Let the replica step out and collect the life that follows. A person could, in that arrangement, keep their body, but trade the world for the compass of containment, tending the wound as part of a continuity no one outside the property could see. Or there was the other option William hinted at, the kind of violence that breaks boundaries. I spent a day arguing with myself in the kitchen like a man trying to bargain with an inner creditor.
If the replica took my place, would anyone know? Would Beth? Would Emma? A life could continue without me. I had been preparing them to do the same for years. The idea of disappearing felt both an erasure and, perversely, a reprieve. It was not noble. It was selfish, in the oldest sense. But the other option, what William had warned about, offered no absolution either. To destroy the machine felt like murder on a theoretical scale, and something inside me recoiled from the notion of pulling apart a sleeping thing in its bed to stop a clock. I am practical, but I am not immune to the moral weight of such acts. I made a plan. I would watch. I would gather evidence. I would document the cycle and take it to someone who could read it. I also kept the key in my pocket and the idea of the wrench under my hand, a small, honest violence waiting at the edge of my being. On the evening of December 30, the house shifted. The hum in the basement thickened like something swelling in a vein. The machine's dials crept toward red. On the porch, the wind carried a smell that wasn't cold. It smelled like savory meat on an open spit and like rot together. An animal memory burned into the nose. The carved rings seemed suddenly to have language in them, lines that held a cadence. My watch lost an hour between meals. William's paper was a map that pulsed. At 11:15 p.m., I took the stairs down with the binder and the wrench. The basement's fluorescent light was a hostile thing, against which shadows strove. The machines were louder. The seal on the refrigeration unit shivered. The figure in the enclosure lay unmoving. The tubes that connected it to the machines pulsed in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, like breathing through a straw. I had the key in my fingers. I had the wrench in my other hand. The room smelled of ozone and something the house kept secret. My mouth tasted of copper and the syrup of adrenaline. I unlocked the enclosure because I wanted to know what would happen if I broke a clock. The metal shrieked, an animal tearing. The mechanism complained and clattered. The figure stirred, and its eyelids fluttered like wings. For a second there was nothing in its face but an engineered emptiness, a blankness shaped to the contour of familiarity. Then its eyes opened. They were my eyes. They looked at me with the kind of attention a mirror has when it finally learns to speak. The eyes opened, and all the rooms I had learned to mark with furniture and meaning rearranged themselves around that single guilty recognition. They were my eyes, in the way a mirror is your face, right color, right distance apart, hollowed with the same little scar from a tree in childhood I had always forgotten until now. For a breath I thought the thing would smile, or at least do nothing, and let me fumble for explanation. Instead, it looked at me with a steady, clinical curiosity, as if it had been waiting in a queue to meet me, and finally the appointment had come due. "Where am I?"
It asked, and the voice was my voice when I phoned Beth on bad days. Calm, accurate, a man reading from a script of his own life. I had a wrench in my hand and a key in my pocket, and a million sensible refusals clustered behind my teeth. Words failed me. "You," I started, and the sound of myself cracked like thin ice. "You're in the house," it said. "You're on site." A last line in the arrival email. Hearing my life rehearsed back at me with that same bland efficiency pushed something in me sideways. Anger felt like a leverage point. Horror was too diffuse. "You're not me." It cocked its head, a small mechanical thing of a movement. "I am what is necessary. I remember my duties. I remember my sister. I remember the bread from the general store and the way she—" It stopped, as if someone had clipped the line, and for a second I heard static where human feeling should have been. There was the moral shape of an impossible decision folding up between us. In the basement, the machines hummed like a patient that expected to be waited on. Above us, the house was a mechanism of normalcy, a clock on the mantel that made time into a metronome and agreed it would be kept. I could walk away, let this thing go to town with my face and my name and my life parceled out in grocery lists and phone calls. I could accept the bargain William had described and take my place tending whatever the wound in the land demanded. Or I could make a choice that felt like theft and violence, and maybe, if I was right, end the vector that produced all of this. If it had been any other man in that enclosure, I might have negotiated, might have bargained for a leash or a season. This creature, this exacting replica with the wrong interior, smiled the way a legal document smiles, with the cold comfort of compliance. "I can go," it said. "I can go and be you."
The sentence landed like a bell knelling in the hollow of the room. To be gone and yet continue, what was that but an erasure with better PR? Beth would be given the continuation of me, calls, a presence at holidays, a man at the edge of her calendar who would never come to bed. I wanted to think of it as kindness toward her. A part of me preferred the steady absence to the slow dissolution into a thing that would live under the house. My hands moved before the rest of me decided what I meant. I slammed the wrench against a glass of the enclosure like a rude bell. The sound was obscene in the fluorescent light. The sealing mechanism screamed, tubes kinked and valves clattered. The replica flinched and raised its hands in a mirrored jerk that read as surprised, which anyone who stared at a mirror learns is the strangest kind of recognition. "Stop," it said. There was a gleam of panic perfectly mimicked, and then the clinical calm returned as if the software had toggled modes. "You can't do this. We were built to continue."
I worked the wrench at the clamps, and the glass went from closed to spider-webbed to a damp, leaking aperture. Warm condensation had gathered where breath met cold plastic. It smelled faintly of disinfectant and the kind of heavy, chemical sleep hospitals wear. I reached in, found the tube connected at the base of its neck, and pinched it. The machine protested with a series of clicks and a peal of lights blazing across the control panel. "You don't get to decide for me," I said, which was a lie. I felt the argument that had set up in my head. Do nothing and the town would be safe, or burn the thing and risk the wound opening. If William's notes were to be believed, and every shard of paper I'd found told the same bleak story, then destroying the replica would destabilize the containment. Machines and loops and carved trees all worked together like teeth. Remove one and the set might gnash. Still, the look in the replica's eyes when those tubes pinched shut was the look of a man whose life was being stripped for no meaningful end beyond continuity. Some part of me could not accept that. I thought about Beth alone in our small apartment and the way she called me at odd hours to read a joke or to tell a thing she'd seen. I thought of everything I would be asked to trade, my name, my body, the right to eat soup with my sister, and felt old, searing regret. "Please," the replica said, and its voice was my sister calling my childhood nickname from a house I'd forgotten. I pulled the main power line. The machine spat, and the draft of the basement seemed to inhale and hold its breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the backup system screamed like vessels being ruptured. A red light flared on the central console in a way that was downright obscene. It read as an alarm and as a declaration. Somewhere above us, through layers of floor and quiet, something enormous took notice. I smashed the glass with the wrench until it gave in, and then I used the wrench like a surgeon's tool, ripping plastic and severing line after line. The replica, panicked and learning fast, scrambled in a clumsy human way across the tile. For what it was worth, it moved like a man. Hands too meticulous in their gestures, feet finding purchase in a body that had been frozen for months. It reached for me, and I pushed it away. It tasted of antiseptic and a ghost of my last meal. "You don't have to do this," it said. "You can. You are a machine," I told it. My words were thinner than I meant. "You are a machine pretending to be my choices." It looked at me as if choice were merely a matter of semantics, and then it did what any successful fraudster would do. It told me items I wanted to believe. It recited one or two of my own jokes, the names of people I loved, the pattern of my work. It tried, with the twitch and mimicry of a thing trained to persuade, to pull the emotional cord that would make my hands still. For a breath that felt like an eternity, I almost believed it. I almost put the wrench down and left it to the town. Then the floor above us convulsed, once, like a heartbeat gone wrong. The chandelier in the parlor swung a little and then returned to stillness. The house emitted a low, grief-struck sound that I had never heard it give before, almost a groan, like settling timbers that decided the joke had run its course. The replica screamed, not because of me, but because the pattern it was installed to carry broke, and in that fracture sound came a wholly different thing. A howl rolled across the property, like the echo of a bell in a canyon. It was animal and deeper than any tree could hold. It was something that smelled of older wind and hunger. The carved lines on the trees seemed to tighten in the dark, as if they were fingers closing around a mouth. I made the choice that would undo the plan of continuity. I set myself to destroy the thing that had been made with my face. I am not proud of the way I did it. There was a moment where I thought of calling out for help, calling Beth, calling Emma, calling anyone, and then the sound of the thing outside cut through intention like a blade. It accelerated everything into a small, sharp arc.
I moved with the brutal efficiency of someone who feels the last of their options slipping away. I ripped the replica's chest padding free, found the lattice of terrifyingly well-made synthetic tissue and cables, and drove the wrench through an exposed junction like a sacrificial rod. Sparks spat, the machines howled, and the enclosure filled with the smell of singed plastic. The replica's mouth formed the words my mother had taught me not to say, a fragment of prayer or a rote compliance, and then the sound drained out of it. I lit the accelerant I had in a spare fuel can for the generator, poured it toward the open panel, and licked the air with a match. Fire is a tidy thing compared to most moral acts. It simplifies. It makes decisions visible. When the first flame took, it ran along the wiring like a bloodline, and the room moved into a new register where all things were either burning or not. The replica thrashed as the flame found its way into composed tissue and circuitry. It screamed with what could have been my voice, my syllables, my cadence, and then the scream turned viscous and animal. In the reflection of shattered glass, I saw my face stretched into a shape I did not recognize. It was me and not me, and the sound I made when I pulled the plug on the main breaker was equal parts victory and self-betrayal. The lab lights flickered, the machines faltered, the containment hum died like a hymn cut short. There was immediate consequence. The carved ring of trees outside did what carved things do when their geometry is disturbed. It shifted. Snow along the inner edge of the circle rose, as if something under the soil had forced air into it.
Branches that had stood like teeth now trembled, and a fresh cracking sound ran through the trunks, a sound like the world splitting into an argument. Something enormous banged against the house like a fist trying to remember its own strength. Upstairs, the parlor window exploded inward. Glass came like a rain of small knives, and a violence that had been kept at bay by careful geometry and electricity decided it was tired of waiting. Limbs, huge, twigged and terrible, punctured the pane and then curled around the siding, working the house like a child messing with a clock. The living room furniture uprooted itself from calm and collided with walls. The chandelier, when it fell, chimed against floorboards in a clean, horrible sequence. I burned the last drives and shoved the binder into my pack. The wrench left a smear on the replica's forehead that would never come clean. I grabbed the brass key and William's letters and flung myself up the ladder like a man possessed by common sense. The sound of the thing, call it guardian, call it the old name that folks muttered on porches, was all around, a deep shifting, a scraping that made the bones of the house vibrate. In the hallway, a painting that had hung for decades was torn free by something that smelled like wet winter and hunger. I ran. My hands saw the path their feet should take before my mind had the grace to think about it. The door to the outside hung crooked on its hinges. Snow spattered in, and the world went from incandescent to blunt and immediate. The night outside was a white wall. The trees were alive in a way I had not permitted myself to imagine. Branches moved with a rude sentience to catch the wind, and beyond them there was a low, rolling bulk that I at first thought was a shadow, until it drew nearer, and I realized it had a head like a ruined man, a neck like braided roots, and a mouth rimed with something that looked like bone. It moved with a gait that was more the sensible slide of a creature used to 1,000 hidden ways through dark things than the chaotic charge of any animal. I ran to the Subaru as if it might carry prayers. The door jammed half-closed behind me, and the key took twice to turn. In the rearview mirror, I saw the house shudder and then begin to tear itself, wood ripping, paint flaking, an unfurling destruction that smelled like the end of an era. The plumes of smoke were not only from the lab. The tree ring was falling into a kind of collapse I had never read about, and the guardian, was unwinding itself like a thread pulled from the land. The engine coughed and then purred. Tires bit into packed snow and slush. I drove because driving is the most human of denials. If you move fast enough, things can't follow. The road back toward Coram was narrow and rhymed with night. Snow spattered against the windshield in sheets. The world was full of the smell of hot chemical smoke, and something else, something green and wild and interior that stuck to the back of my throat. For a while, the car sheltered me. For a while, the speed held the world neatly separated into here and there. The house receded in the rear window like any obscene geography should. Behind me, the sound of a large, patient displeasure tracked along the ridge of the land. There were, I later learned, other sounds, distant alarms in town, dogs howling with a specificity I had never credited animals with before. Then my hands began to change. It started as a numbness in my fingers, a subtling of sensation, as if the world was turning up the contrast on uncomfortable things. The accelerator pedal seemed to ask less for pressure and more for surrender. My nails, once trimmed and neat, split at the edges like soft wood.
Skin thickened along the knuckles until the impression of my palm on the steering wheel read like bark pressed into rubber. When I flexed my hands in the cold, they did not answer the way they had when I was 32 and uncompromised. They answered with a small, animal click. Memories rushed in with the speed of a crowd leaving a theater. Flashes of men on porches I did not remember, the taste of a soup I had never eaten in a kitchen in a town I had not visited. Other voices crowded into mine, snatches of William cursing, Robert's old man cough, an angry, high voice talking about a ledger in 1951. Images layered until my own private archive felt less like a life and more like an attic where strangers' boxes had been left to settle into dust. I understood then the true cruelty of the machine in the house. It had not only copied a face, whatever the mechanism was, biological, electrical, ritual, I did not care which, it carried memory like a contagion. It had been built to create continuity. That continuity required pattern, and the easiest pattern was human habit. I could see all the ways the thing had been designed to slide into my life without force. It learned me by echo, by small mimicry, by the neat inventory of a man's predictable gestures. In exchange, the original, the tending part, absorbed what the house found useful and what the land required. Identities were reallocated like currency. I smelled the first truth of my new shape as a physical thing. The air tasted of iron and sap and old rot. My cheek itched in a place that had no cause to itch, and then the skin there flaked off in a wafer that looked at me like a note. Panic is a compass that points to the nearest action. I headed for town because towns are where rules still live. In Coram, people kept minutes and municipal codes and paper. They did not, or so I told myself, harder monsters the way forests do. Maybe that was cowardice. Maybe it was a plan. The road thinned, and in the next moment, a tree limb, huge, clawed with old bark, fell across the highway like a judgment. There was no way to stop.
I swerved, and the Subaru began to slide, tires fighting for the last grip. The headlights skated along the white and found a black mouth in the earth. The stream bridge I'd crossed on the way out had been beat by weather, and something else. The bridge gave like a cleanly broken promise. The car went end over end into an abyss of white and wood and a freezing current that smelled like minerals and old knives. The impact took my breath for good and honest minutes, and then left something else in its place. I remember not the pain so much as a long, sculpting pressure, as if some smith were kneading muscle into a new shape. My leg was trapped, and something damp encircled my calf. I vomited snow, and the taste of it was the same as the taste of the lab. I should have died there, face washed by honest river water, a final absolution. Instead, the river was a baptistry and returned me changed. My body, betrayed by all that had happened in the basement, responded to the new design like it had been waiting for instruction. Bones slid like gears into new orientations that made sense in some other body's grammar. Under my skin there were fibers now, thin, interlocking seams that ran along the forearm and down the thigh, like the growth of a plant in a new direction. My breath went shallow and long, and then the world tilted into a perception that was not wholly human. I could hear the sledding of snow in a radius that made me dizzy, the subtle shift in a rabbit's heartbeat half a field away, the keening of a child in Coram that belonged to a radio playing over a block away. My sense of hunger settled like a legal claim against my will. I staggered from the wreck on hands that no longer always obeyed me. They were efficient things at that stage, better at tearing, less skilled at the small decorum on turning hinges. I made for the road, because roads are the world's memory. If I could walk into town, maybe I could do the courtesy of being seen and understood. Maybe a bullet would find some weak seam. Maybe a neighbor with an old .22 would do what clocks and machines had failed to do. In town, Emma saw me first, at the corner by the general store. She was carrying a bag of groceries, and when her eyes hit my face, she dropped everything. For a beat, the world felt balanced. I believed for a frail human second that she could be the anchor I needed. Her hands trembled, and she called my name the way a person calls for a friend across a crowded room, loud and disbelieving. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to explain the math of the house, and how we had been made to trade, and how the ring of trees had teeth like law. But the words that came were not the words I had used for years. They were clipped and full of hunger. Emma stepped back, and then, because small towns have rules cruised in by habit, other people gathered. Robert was there before the others, because he always was.
He had a look on his face like somebody who had seen this page of the script before and had trained himself not to stop the play. His eyes were grave, and in the way old men watch fights, there was a memory that ran like an ache across his features. He called my name, and it hung between us like a request. My throat tried to answer, but instead something in my jaw flexed and a low sound leaked out, a noise human words could never match. Silence fell in quorum in the sort of way that is prescribed by ancient rules, the gathering around a blazing thing for warmth and the polite lowering of voices. I remember wanting bitterly for Beth to be there. I remember thinking of all the small habits that had charmed my life, the jar of pickles she preferred, the bad late-night TV show, our shared muttered jokes about the landlords. The hunger that lived in me took names like these and folded them into demands. "You have to leave," Robert said finally, as if to me. His voice sounded like a ledger being closed. "We can't." I do not remember crossing the space between him and the street. I remember feeling an ungentle strength in my new hands and how it replied to stimuli with an almost erotic kind of efficiency. Robert's face did not register pain the way you see it on television. It registered surprise and then a retreat into the part of him that had learned to be small in the presence of bigger things. He turned and ran in the way old men run when they still owe a life a debt. I ran after him, and then the last sensible parts of me, the memory of being human and of letters and of consequence, tried once more to bargain for a graceful end. I thought of the cliff road beyond Coram, the place people used to go to watch the sky unroll itself for New Year's Eve. There were stories there, men who drove to the lip to watch the town below like a sheet of light. Maybe I could find a place where physics without ceremony would extricate me. The climb to Devil's Ridge, so the children called it, was a feverish business. My body moved with the certainty of something that had finally been allowed to find its pacing. Snow crunched under weight that had lengthened. The moon was a white coin folded into the world, and below it Coram had the little warm windows of a community that believed in small certainties. I could see Emma on the porch, slumped and pale, and the silhouette of Robert limping away when I had passed him. At the lip, I stood with one hand on the rail as if that would fix any of this. The wind was a clean knife. The town smelled below like bread and coal smoke and dog fur. I considered the plunge and felt that old, human thing people call regret. I thought of Beth, thought of my sister's laugh, and I thought that maybe, if things had been different, we would have argued about movies and life and whether to buy a new couch. I closed my eyes and stepped out, because sometimes the easiest moral act is to remove yourself from the equation.
The fall took long enough for a man to taste shame and small triumph. The world became a rushing catalogue of things my human mind understood. Wind, a blur of stars, the rush of cold. There was the half-second when landing felt like the final good answer to all questions. I hit a projection of earth that was not tidy. The limb I struck sunk and gave under me, and the thing, what I had become and what the house made of me, did something impossible. Instead of ending, the fall turned into a roll and then into a crawl. My ribs folded like a coat being buttoned wrong and then reassembled into something new. I had thought of death as the correct and elegant release. The land thought otherwise. When I stood, because that is what I did, I was not all bone and blood. I was, for want of a simpler phrase, partially done. My chest was less human and more an architecture of seams and tendon and something like cambium. I could smell the town as if it broke into layers, the fermentation of the bakery bread, the sour curl of old beer, a child's fever. I tasted guilt like iron on my tongue and hunger like a separate heartbeat. I wandered back into Coram because there was nothing else to do. People scattered like well-trained birds. Some of them hid in houses and watched through curtains. Others left their windows open in a way that seemed to me a plea. If something wanted to keep us safe, it should be able to go about its duty quietly. They did not understand the new logic driving me. The house had asked for tending, and in my absence it had crafted me into a form that could satisfy the wound it was built to tend. I was, trivially, the wrong answer, shaped into a new kind of right. What followed, for the town, was small disasters wearing the face of a hunt. Chickens vanished in the periphery of yards. Dogs wandered off and were found later, a mile or two into the wood, hale and yet somehow changed, duller-eyed, quieter. Windows were broken and then repaired. People stopped asking questions in earnest and learned to keep their lights on certain nights. It is a town's work in a place like Coram to learn the patterns of its own vulnerability
and schedule its fear. I did not want to hurt them. That is a thing humans tell stories about themselves to preserve some moral shape. I wanted to fulfill what I had been made to fulfill, and if leftovers came with that duty, then the world had reasons that would be weighed later by things that do not exist for us. The memories of the men whose faces I now found nested inside the corners of my mind whispered at me like little ghosts. A ledger, a name, a laugh. I could not keep them apart from the thing that wanted meat. William's paper was the thing that kept me human in the hours between hunger and satisfied pattern. I thought of him often, how he had tried to explain in careful script, and then had the grace to fail.
Perhaps, in the end, people die because they lack imagination, because they cannot bear the logic required to keep the thing caged. Or maybe they die because the price of payment is so high that no practical man can ever pay it without losing the smallest tender part of himself. There is a finality I did not meet on the ridge. I had wanted to stop it. I had tried every human option and every violent interruption I could conceive. In the end, the system that had made me continued to do its work, and I became the thing it designed. The narrative trick here is tragic inevitability. The man who tries to break out of continuity is folded back in as a better-suited instrument. I am writing this in fits and in ruins, and I offer it precisely because the house would prefer that no one know. In the days after Devil's Ridge, the town learned to tidy around our new rules. The Blackwell estate burned down to a slow smoldering. Some nights you can still see faint embers in the ring where the trees were carved. The town council's minutes that followed studied the property as if it were a legal problem, and if you ever read them, they will say things like unusual structural failure and mitigation underway. They will call it an accident, and for a while that keeps the thin math of comfort in classically human order. The evidence I left is both deliberate and shy. I could have tried to contact people directly, but the part of me that is now less a man and more a thing understands subtlety. I left files, yes, copies of William's original letters in a map case in the general store, a thumb drive at the bottom of Marjorie's book drop labeled with my name like a bad joke. I left photographs clipped to page edges in the library, one of a man in 1938 who looked like me, one of a ledger with intervals ticked in the margin. The idea is not that someone will read and act. The idea is that someone will see the face and remember that they saw it. Curiosity, like a slow insect, does most of the work. You will find a string of items if you look for them. My own journal, this thing you are reading now, was for a while a rationalization. I wrote in ink at first because it felt like a rule. Then I started to scratch in pencil when my hand refused to hold a pen the way it once had. The handwriting changes across pages, from deliberate loops to tight animal slashes. I have tried to mark days with numbers, and they blur into each other like spilled ink. Day 37, New Year's Eve. The town is lights out for the most part. People think the holiday means masks and the counting down. They do not count us in their equations anymore. I saw Emma last week. She gave me bread without looking and asked me to spend less time near her house. The kindness was a blade. I wanted to tell Beth where I had gone. I wanted to write her a letter and push it into the mailbox, but I worry more now that letters are too human a thing for what I have become.
I have watched the cycles continue their slow movement. The carved patterns in the trees, even charred, still hold. New marks have been made by hands that do not tremble. The town is learning and consolidating its silencio. People like that. Silence is tidy. It keeps the dailies in their boxes. If you are reading this, or if whatever receives these words, then I want you to know what I could not make myself do. Ended clean. I tried. I burned a made man in the basement. I did violence to the substitute, because I could not accept the theft of my life as a mercy. That choice did one thing that was clear, and another that was invisible. The clear thing was that the machine smiled like an unrepentant accountant, and then lost its footing. The invisible thing was that whatever the house required from me began properly its work sooner. The wound the house tended does not like loose ends. It repairs by remaking the hands that do the tending. There will be people who will read this and who will decide it is a parable or a proper cautionary note. There will be others who will fling it in a drawer and forget it. Please do not be one of those folk who forget.
the pattern extends. Whatever you call this, guardian, old name, fault line, if you find a house that offers you a choice and a contract and an alarmingly perfect salary, answer the call of the town. Run. My last human acts are not dramatic. I did not shoot myself on Devil's Ridge. I did not cry to the sky. I tried, stupidly, and with all the logic I had, to buy time and then to punish a counterfeit. In the calculus of the house, that was an option, and the house took it and made the cost of my decision a thing that would be paid by a pattern rather than an end. I can no longer say all the things I used to. Simple requests, the pronouncements that make a life into something you can parcel to another. Sometimes, when the moon is a white coin and I move through fields, I hear a child calling my name from a distance, and the sound settles in my chest like a stone. I have the peculiar and impossible grief of a monster that remembers the small kindnesses of being human, of the coffee stains, of Betslav. Those memories are nettles that hold me to the edges of whatever I have become. There are documents you can find in the town archives if you have the will to dig, the ones Marjorie pulled from me before I left the library. They are precisely what they have always been, footnoted, careful, and full of euphemism. There is a ledger on a shelf with 7-year ticks in the margin if you open the right drawer. There are photographs with faces reappearing across decades, and the same stone of a building in the background. There is William's name, his neat handwriting, and there is my own, less neat, more urgent. I have left copies of my last letters in places where people pick them up and say, "That is sad," and put them down again.
Sadness is a neat cover for things that would otherwise provoke a late, foolish courage. If I had been kinder, maybe I would have let the replica go to town and occupy my life in a comfortable lie. If I had been weaker, maybe I would have accepted the gentle erasure. If I had been smarter, maybe I would have understood how to break the machinery without breaking the ring. Who knows? The only solid thing I can report is the way the world now measures out my presence, in the occasional hoofprint near a riverbank, in the odd jam of radio static over the town that sounds like a throat being cleared, in the way Emma sometimes leaves an extra loaf of bread on her steps at night. I do not think of redemption in the old sense. There is a terrible kind of continuity to these things. Men take shifts, houses keep their secrets, towns learn to live with the pattern. The house I burned, the building where the basement lab sat, has been replaced by a different mouth. New wires run along the ridge. A different man, or perhaps that same program with a new casing, watches the road. Blackwell's name is less often spoken, but his ledger lives on in loose sheets. You will want to know if the town will survive the thing I have become. I cannot answer with the clean information you crave. There will be nights when I pass one of the main streets and people will shut their curtains and tell their children it is only the wind. There will be other nights when a dog will cry and not come home. The cost of what has been arranged is not a single sharp end, but an attrition the size of a winter. The world gets a little thinner where I pass, and a little hungrier. I am leaving this document in the places I know humans look for truth, in drawers, in book drops, taped under shelves where hand will pause. I cannot promise it will bring you safety. I cannot promise that, if you find an offer on a bright yellow PDF with a salary you have never seen before and directions that are oddly specific, you will not be tempted. I can only promise you will have to choose. And if you step into the orbit of the house, if you listen to its politely phrased contract, remember the 2 forms it needs to keep its wound closed, one to go into the world and one to tend the wound. Remember that continuity is a kind word for a cycle that eats names. If you have reached the end of this page, and you know anyone who likes deep, slow burn stories, or who works as a caretaker of isolated properties, tell them to be careful. Share this if you have to. Keep it in your mind as a small, pessimistic candle you can hold up to the dark. I do not know how long I will remain this way. The thing that was me moves with the patience of frost. It is not brutal for the sake of show. It is methodical. It remembers that there will always be another winter, another contract, another time when a man with too many debts and too few options reads an email and says yes.
If you ever come to Coram and the Blackwell estate seems quieter than the others, do not go looking out of folklore. Go to the library, open the drawer with the town minutes, and find the list. I am not the last caretaker. The math that made me writes in unwavering numbers. Final entry, New Year's Day. The sky is clear, and the town below is quiet in a way that looks like sleep, but smells like a withheld plea. I will go down tonight into the black places that still breathe. I will keep the wound as best I can within the constraints given. I will try not to be what I now remember men to be. I will keep the ledger clean. I will try to remember Beth when I hunger. If you are reading this and curiosity moved you, if you chose to pull this thread with your eyes and your hands, then for God's small mercy, do one thing. Tell someone else. Keep a record. The house prefers silence. It is what it feeds on. And if you must go up there for reasons you cannot unmake, knock on Emma's counter and ask for Marjorie's hours. They will not lie outright. They will give you half-truths that feel like protection. That is all I can offer. One last thing, because even the thing I have become carries an old man's superstition. Consider the word guardian a file name rather than a blessing. Call it something else if you must. Names have weight. Calling it by any name does not change what it wants. If this account has landed with you like a stone in a pond, there is an attachment in the pinned description where I have left photographs, scans of William's letters, and the clippings Marjorie set aside. They will not save anyone, but they might make the math legible in case you have to argue with someone who believes that the house is only a building. I am going now. The cold is a different thing from the past, and the hunger is patient. The town will sleep and keep its own account. The ring of carved trees still waits like a mouth. What men once called a ward now calls me what I am, tending. If you like slow burn horror and careful small disasters, hit subscribe. Please do not make the same mistake I made.